Thank you all very much for being here. Welcome to the National Growth Areas Alliance workshop on data centres and what they mean for growth areas. My name is Bronwyn Clark. I'm the CEO of the NGAA, and it's great to see so many familiar faces in the workshop today, but it's just as exciting to see new faces from across our membership. And it's very great and exciting to note that every single one of our member councils is represented on our call here today. I would like to just quickly share my screen and note that I'd like to acknowledge that I'm meeting you on the lands of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nations out in southeast Melbourne, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that to the traditional owners of the lands and waters from which you are meeting us today. To extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on the call today. Before we begin, I would like to thank Anne Herney, the National Growth Areas Alliance National Research and Policy Lead, for her work in getting this important piece of work happening, and also Michelle Jack for getting this workshop off the ground. So thank you all. We are here today because growth areas are a key target for data centres, and I'll just scroll through those slides. So thank you. It's a really important issue. It's new, it's fast moving. There is a lot going on in this space, and I think it's really important that we have this conversation. So we know that many of our members are coming across some quite challenging circumstances with data centre applications. We also know some are seeing it as great opportunities. Whichever side you're on with the challenge and opportunities, I think mostly it's a balance between the two. And the thing we know across the board is this is going to be a really significant issue for growth areas in the near future. So we're approaching today as very much as a listening exercise from the NGAA perspective. We've brought in some expert voices, but just as importantly, we want to hear from you because this is part of a broader process. We need to assess what growth areas are experiencing around data centres, and then we need to clarify from you where we can add value as an alliance. So as you all know, part of what we do is learning from each other, but part of what we do is actually pull together policy positions and advocate on your behalf. So at the end of this process, we'll be writing up all our notes, and that will inform our next piece of work on this issue. But why data centres matter is sort of shown on this slide here. Australia has emerged as one of the most significant data centre markets in Asia Pacific region. There is billions of dollars invested already, and we know that you are all, most of you, we have heard directly, are being bombarded almost by DAs for data centres. And we feel it's really important from an advocacy perspective to note that that is happening in terms of industrial land use. At the same time as all of you, our member councils, are allocated to build 26% of the Housing Accord targets by 2029. So that's over 300,000 new homes that will all be going into your municipalities at the same time as you're dealing quite often with multiple, if not in the dozens, of data centre applications. We are, as you know, a national organisation, and so part of our role will be to look at how different states are responding to the data centre challenge, as well as how they all fit in with the national framework. You'll see from this list, and if we had a look at each of those documents, some of them are very fresh. So there are state governments who are literally right in the weeds of developing their own policies and strategies here, and there are others who have already amended planning regulations to fast track data centres. So how today will run is that in a moment I'll introduce our guest speaker to talk to us about the state of data centres and development in Australia, market trends, investment drivers, that sort of thing. And then the second half of today we'll move into a facilitated workshop with Astrolab Group, and they'll be focusing on what this means for local government and then what can we do about it. We will put you into some allocated breakout rooms for more facilitated conversation, which should be much easier in such a large group today. So I'd also like to just acknowledge and welcome Belinda Komnenos, Amanda Young, and Michael Komnenos from Astrolab Group, who will be talking with you in the second part of this session. But next, I would like to introduce Jordan Pangallo, who is the Senior Manager of Research at Colliers Australia. He's a bit of an expert in this field around data centre investment. He is well known to local government as well, and you'll see here he wrote a report last year on data sovereignty. I did practice that word, but I still messed it up. So data sovereignty and what it means for the property market for data centres. So we'll have some time for Q&A afterwards, but Jordan, I'll hand over to you. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you very much. My name is Jordan Pangallo. I'm the National Industrial Property Researcher at Colliers. I also have with me some colleagues, Arun and Richard. Arun is our National Industrial Lead in Engineering based in Sydney. We also have Richard, who's the Director of Strategic Development based in Perth. So if you guys want to just give a wave, they'll be able to answer some of the more technical questions you might have at the end of this presentation. Okay, so the report that we wrote about a year ago now really was to focus on the demand drivers of data centers. It's been established for a while now that there is a considerable supply pipeline. You had some data statistics even in the first part of this webinar. But what we really wanted to uncover was what were the demand drivers behind that? Is it being led by demand? And then also, is there a potential supply oversupply risk? So this presentation, much like the report, is broken up into three key sections. The first being the drivers of data center growth, with our twin engines being data consumption and data sovereignty. Second, we'll go a little bit more of a deep dive into the supply and demand dynamics of data centers. And finally, we'll cover through our outlook and then give some more direct insights, and we'll show you some maps about and potentially where the potential pipeline might look and how that feeds into the various areas that are being covered today. So before we dive into the actual research, I just thought I'd highlight some of the key terms. I'm going to be talking about supply and take up and loads and power. So I thought just put up the terms that we've got there, but if there's any questions, I'm not sure about how well everyone on the call knows about the different terminology used for data centers. But I've just wanted to highlight that. So we've got so generally for supply and demand for data centers, we don't use the same standard area-based metrics we use for commercial property. They are measured by capacity or load, and that's to do with power capacity. So supply will refer to the IT load in terms of megawatts of data halls that are to be delivered. And then you've got take up, which refers to the demand for the least IT load, again in megawatts. So we have then a categorization of supply and demand, the first of which being live. So that refers essentially to your existing data centers and the data center capacity that's available. You've then got under construction. That refers to IT loads of data halls that are undergoing fit out or mechanical or electrical equipment. So that's slightly different to how we would probably refer to under construction in traditional commercial property settings. The building may be complete, but this is just about fitting out the remainder of the data hall. And then you've got committed, that refers to the IT load of projects where there is a certain amount of confidence in the eventual addition to the live supply or the total data center market. These generally will have all of the appropriate services and are about 10 or so years into up to 10 years into the pipeline. And then we've got early stage. Now, early stage, I will highlight some of these stats throughout the report, but it's probably best to have to not focus too much on the early stage development. These are ones that DC Byte, who provided our data, have highlighted. There is the eventual case for a data center development, but that is significantly far back in the pipeline. They don't have all of the elements required for development. And then finally, we have vacancy rates, which refers to the percentage of available, so existing live supply versus your total live supply and that's only for co-location sites. Okay, so section 1, data consumption and data sovereignty. So the twin engine drivers driving data center growth. So data creation has been accelerating exponentially. There's been advances in technology that have fundamentally changed how data is generated, stored, and consumed, and the pace has just been accelerating. AI, automation, IoT, 5G are embedding data into everyday activity, and this has caused exponential growth in data volumes. So Australians are already amongst the most connected globally. We have, with average household data usage, about 8 times higher than a decade ago, and that's expected to double again by 2029, according to the NBN. So as data volumes grow, where that data is stored has become just as important as how it's used. And that's where data sovereignty comes into play and has moved into the forefront globally, with governments treating data as strategic national asset amid rising geopolitical and technological tensions. So data sovereignty asserts that data is subject to the laws and governance exclusively of the country in which it's collected and stored. So to improve data sovereignty, Australia has first been focusing on data residency, which is the requirement that data generated within the country be stored and processed locally. And so that's been our foundational step to ensure that Australian data, particularly sectors like healthcare, finance, government, remains within national borders. And then it's also easier to enforce compliance with some of our domestic privacy laws, such as the Privacy Act and the Australian Privacy Principles, and some of those other new legislations that have just come through in the last few months as well. So moving on to the next section, so the demand-supply mismatch. So this is where as those data consumption and sovereignty requirements continue to rise, Australia's data centre market has been experiencing significant imbalance between supply and demand. So I'm going to run through a little bit of the data that particularly this will be the more data heavily focused area and what's been happening in particular markets across Australia. So the numbers do, at the first instance, tell a really compelling story. In the past 20 years, total data center occupancy in Australia has grown 40-fold, from just 37 megawatts in 2005 to 1,315 megawatts in 2025. And 67% of that growth has occurred in the past 5 years alone. That's been driven obviously by the pandemic, remote work, and the rise of AI as more data is created and stored in Australia. Take up for data centers has increased 27 times in the past 5 years. And particular note is that the share of total Australian data center capacity used for the public sector data has risen from less than 1% in 2015 to 12% in 2025. So this isn't necessarily just an indicator of AI and generative AI. This is very much a case of all industries are very much growing and rapidly increasing. So in the past 5 years, data centers hosting the public cloud has been the largest growth in take-up by data center type. So these figures highlight a real fundamental shift in Australia's digital infrastructure landscape. The rapid acceleration in data center occupancy, the surge in AI workloads, have all pointed to a transformation driven by two dominant forces, being that unprecedented data demand and that strategic importance of data sovereignty, is particularly for public government agency data, as we've shown. Okay, so Australia's data center market has reached a critical inflection point, with demand now growing faster than supply, capacity take-up exceeding new deliveries for the past 3 consecutive years since 2023. So if you look at that graph on the left-hand side, what we're really seeing is take-up traditionally has been and supply have traditionally been well aligned, but for the last 3 years, that has consistently year on year been outpacing supply. And so this imbalance isn't temporary, it's not or cyclical, it's a real fundamental shift in digital infrastructure requirements that are being driven by all those drivers that I mentioned before. So however, whilst 2023 was the first year where demand exceeded new supply, the pressure had been building for years, for the years prior. So from 2021 to 2024, total net take-up of data center capacity surpassed the amount of new capacity delivered over the same period, which means that historically, even though supply and demand growth has tracked quite closely, that alignment has broken down completely now, and there's a widening gap between capacity that's delivered and capacity that's required. So this is now the longest sustained period of demand growth exceeding supply growth since records began in 2005. And it's really highlighting that there's a significant undersupply that's reshaping pricing, land use, and also of less importance, but also what I'll touch on is investment strategies and what's happening within our commercial property markets. So what that supply and demand imbalance has done is it has pushed vacancy rates to record lows. So traditionally, we've always had a little bit of an oversupply of data center capacity. There's always been a surplus of available capacity, and different in different markets, but for the most part, there's been a little bit of a spread there. But now Australia's data center capacity has fallen, and it's at its record lowest of 7% at the end of 2025. So that's changed from 9% when I did this report only 9 months ago, and that's significantly less than the long-term average of 21% as well. And you're seeing on that left-hand side, that chart there is just showing pretty much across all markets, vacancy rates have just, they're on a decline annually every year across markets. So most major markets are now below historical norms. So if you look on the right-hand side, that table over there, you've got Melbourne's particularly tight at 4%, Sydney at 5%, and even Perth, which has always had a little bit more of surplus availability and at an average of about 53% vacancy, that's now fallen to 38%. The next key focus and what we really wanted to tackle as part of this report is there are some really heavy, considerable potential bottlenecks on the horizon. So what this chart on the right-hand side shows is the DC market absorption times. That is, so if there was no new supply to be delivered, how long would it take using average take-up figures over the last 3 years to reach capacity and have no vacant data center space left remaining. So really, in Melbourne, had the lead, and that could really fall to just about 4 months around Q1 2025. And that had previously, only in 2023, would have taken about 8 years to reach capacity. So the time it's going to take to reach capacity is much quicker, and clearly an indicator that supply delivered is not really keeping up with take up. New supply is not keeping up with take up. So the final section we have is our outlook. So as of December 2025, 81% of all data center capacity currently under construction has already been pre-committed, which is well above the long-term average of 38%. It's also well above the average that we had when we first did this report, which was 68%. So it's a really considerable take up for the pipeline that hasn't even been delivered yet. Now, as I mentioned, so there's about 8,000, over 8,000 megawatts in the committed and early stage. But as I mentioned, really the early stage developments don't have all the right elements. And what that really shows is that there's only about 25% of our pipeline, that really huge 8,000 megawatt pipeline, is actually ready or even has the right elements for delivery. So again, with our bottleneck analysis as well, you can see that even the committed pipeline, which could take upwards of 10 plus years to be delivered, that pipeline, if it came through even today, it could be absorbed within 9 years. So we've got a gap between what's actually in the pipeline versus how quickly it could be absorbed. And that's of considerable note as well. So we did have a piece here from our engineering team. Chris Gallagher, our Director of Strategic Development in Engineering Design, couldn't be here today, but he had a piece within the report to really highlight that we're far from being oversupplied with data for data center capacity at the moment. Our planning, engineering, design teams work daily with operators, and we see firsthand where supply is getting stuck. And so while pipeline, as I mentioned, it can look quite large on paper, power availability, water, security and delivery certainly are what can really cause projects to proceed. So data centers are now comparable to city shaping residential projects. When you've got campuses that reach 30 plus hectares and target hundreds of megawatts, delivery becomes less about land availability and more about infrastructure coordination and planning certainty. So operators highly risk averse, so delays in utilities or approvals often pause projects altogether. Government policy momentum is moving in the right direction, but agencies are increasingly aware of the constraints. However, historical experience has shown that without major investment in power and water infrastructure and materially faster approvals, oversupply is highly unlikely. And as a result, demand is expected to continue running ahead of delivery and reinforcing the need for early engagement, innovative servicing solutions, and long-term resilient infrastructure planning to future-proof the market. I'm going to cover through just our key markets and provide a little bit of an outlook for you. So firstly, we have Sydney. You can see on the right-hand side, we've got our pipeline, most of which is in that early stage, but there are some committed committed data centers, mostly out towards the west, your outer west and southwest precincts, a little bit in probably in Wetherill Park, and then pretty much everything west of Wetherill Park. Then you've got a little bit up north, particularly around Macquarie Park, but those I think there's been some changes to legislation around there that may have made this map a little bit different to what it might look like today. But really, what's particularly of note is that there's 72% of space under construction is already leased. That's double the long-term average of 40%. So even though there's this capacity that's coming online is quite significant, most of it has already been taken up. There is already demand there for that capacity. Sydney has the largest supply pipeline, but it also has the most significant barriers of entry. And so power and water constraints have been a particular driver for our clients. And finally, there are future bottlenecks likely. So the high demand and slow future supply could create constraints within the next decade, and really see, even though there might be some robust supply that's coming through, we are still seeing there's quite considerable bottlenecks, particularly if all of our under construction pipeline and even through to our committed pipeline is already committed. For Melbourne, it is as projected to be the largest city by 2032. There has been a call for Melbourne to be a longer term hub for data generation and local data center infrastructure. Melbourne is on track to grow the fastest within the data center market, and so there is a little bit of competition between Sydney and Melbourne about maintaining and growing that pipeline. But even more disconcerting is there's around 97% of Melbourne's under construction pipeline is already pre-committed. So that's well even above Sydney's of circa 70%, and shows that there's quite strong near-term demand. And finally, nearly half of Australia's longer-term committed and early-stage data center capacity is located in Melbourne. So we really start to see a ramp up of data center capacity expanding into Melbourne, and that's again towards your west and north Melbourne, with not too much in the southeast and outer east. For Brisbane, so there is also significant population growth. There is calls, so there is a need to have data centers near our main population hubs. And so with Brisbane accounting for 20% of Australia's population, it's though delivered 29% of the national population growth to December 2024. And that's really strengthening its role as a national data center landscape. It doesn't have a significant pipeline though. So it's only got about 2 megawatts under construction and only 27 megawatts in the committed or early stage pipeline. And then finally, at current demand levels, the entire pipeline could be absorbed in under 4 years. So that's including those really early stage developments, which really signals that there is a need for new stock to meet steady demand. We didn't do in the report a particular deep dive on Adelaide and Perth, but given that there are some local councils here today from those cities, I thought I'd pull up just a little bit more of an insight into Adelaide and Perth. These markets are still fairly small, particularly Adelaide. So Adelaide doesn't have actually any sites under construction. I believe there's only one committed data center in the pipeline. That's actually already an existing data center that's just aiming to expand its capacity. There are some more early stage developments, but they are very, very early in the pipeline. Perth, has the potential to really expand. And Richard can talk to this if further if there's questions that come through. But there are two sites and 6 megawatts under construction in Perth, both of which are in the northern part of the city. But there is also an additional 2 data centers that could be built from 2028 onwards. And that could almost double the amount of capacity that Perth currently has. So there's a significant potential for Perth and less so for Adelaide at this stage. And just move on then to our final section, so looking at capital markets and investment outlook. I figure this won't be of too much relevance to this group, but I just wanted to highlight some of the key points. So data center, the role of data centers and demand and value uplift that is being created from data centers has brought about significant premiums to industrial land. So data centers are increasingly the highest and best use for industrial land, and they're often outcompeting those traditional logistics and manufacturing, and through obviously higher revenue potential and stronger tenant covenants. As a result, there's been a rising data center development is absorbing prime industrial and logistics land, and that's been further constraining our industrial supply. So we're actually at Colliers, we're working on a report further highlighting and focusing on industrial land within Sydney. And just as a key note that might be of interest is that whilst we've traditionally seen about 9% of industrial land supply being dedicated to data centers, that could get upwards of 33% within the next 12 to 24 months. So it's really, really considerable, and it's taking up what already constrained industrial land that there is. And so that's will have a major impact, and they'll also have a major impact for investors in who they choose, what they choose to develop. There is a lot of capital that is going into data centers. One of our most significant industry surveys, the PERE Perspectives 2025 survey, identified that data centers are now the most favored real estate sector among institutional investors for 2026. Data centers are increasingly being valued, and there's a lot of capital that is looking to be deployed across Australia. Pretty much for most of the reasons that we've covered of those demand drivers, you've got your significant demand, but there's also data sovereignty, and those components are now having a significant influence into our capital markets, and there is significant capital that wants to be deployed here, and will continue to do so in the foreseeable future. And so I'll just leave this here at the end as a summary, just some key takeaways. Happy to just leave this on the screen for now, and then can go to your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Jordan. It's fascinating and mind-blowing all at the same time. So thanks for that overview. There's a couple of questions coming in the comments. So I'll just read the first ones out if it's easier for you. From Adam Hogan at Wallandilly Shire Council. What else apart from power and water do data centres need, and why do they need to be near population centres?
Yeah, so power and water are the predominant needs. Data centers do also have significant other constraints, more so than traditional industrial logistics land. So they are further constrained by biodiversity, by fire hazard risks. They play a key part in what makes a data center development feasible. Arun, if you're still on the line, I think you probably would be good as an answer to expand on this. Is there anything else that you're seeing here?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I've also asked the same question: why do they need to be near population centers? It's actually to do with the availability zone of the data center. So you actually require maybe 2 to 3 data centers in the area just in case one goes down, you've got a backup. And also the loss of data transfer as well to the general public. You can do data centers outside populated areas, but they need to be more AI-based data centers rather than cloud-based data centers. But other than that, like Jordan said, water and power are the major constraints for a data center. Some data centers, especially anything, say, 80 megawatts and above, probably needs its own zone substation being built there, which takes about 5,000 squares to put in. So there is quite a bit of constraints in relation to power and water. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. If I could just continue that with you, Arun, around bushfire prone land. Is there a BAL rating they require? And then is there any thinking at state level around policies to encourage in former mining areas where there is power and water, for example?
There isn't anything in mining areas that I've seen, but there is actually something that we were actually discussing in one of the feasibilities that I was doing recently, because the whole area was flood prone, like 80% of the land, but obviously the 20% where the data center was above the 1% AEP. So there had to be a lot of compensatory storage around the site, potentially treating that water to a level where it can be reused in a data center for cooling purposes, is something that well, we're exploring. I don't think it can be done yet. It needs to be a certain level, obviously, for it to be used. In terms of the building, I haven't actually done a data center building. We usually just do all the civil work. So Richard, I think, does work with Next
Yes,
DC.
so our built form team has built
Yep.
several. A lot of those ratings will come from either the local jurisdictions or the BCA or the building codes. So whatever those codes or local requirements are needed, we'll definitely have to abide by them. Obviously, it's there's a lot of cooling that goes along with these centres. Some of those don't like smoke, but in terms of the requirements, they're whatever the requirements are for whether it's a data center or a commercial building. So whatever class of building that is, it falls into those jurisdictions. There was another question here on which I wouldn't mind answering as well while I've got the floor.
Sure.
Well, sorry, I'm just scrolling up. There's been quite a few. Talked about solar panels.
Yeah.
So,
Are there any sort of requirements or regulations to control water usage?
Yeah, a lot of the data center operators are looking at ESG and green requirements. However, the power demands make so. For example, we've worked on several inner city data centers, both in Perth and Darwin, and we've done some feasibility studies in the East Coast. What we find that even if you were to put solar panels across the whole roof, a lot of these bigger data centers require 10 times that amount of power. So whilst it is an important requirement to think through, the amount of square meters that you would need of solar panels are quite significant to be self-generating.
What about heat? What about power from heat generation? Can that be?
There are certain things that the mechanical consultants are looking at the moment, and there are some of these like heat generating systems. However, what we've seen typically is the power needs to be very, very stable. And so that's the other thing about solar panels, that only supplies power when the sun shines. Same with the heat. The heat is actually relatively stable, but anything you do with a data center, they have double, triple redundancy. So everything really needs to be highly stable water supply, power supply, redundancy around fibre optics, all of those sorts of things. So I hope that's answered somewhat of the question at a high level.
Yeah, we're sort of out of time, but I wonder if I could just do a quick fire rapid round for a minute. Can data centres be built underground? And alternatively, can you build on top of data centres?
Yes, and structurally, yes, you can, although a lot of the mechanical equipment is on the top. So
Okay.
is that quick fire enough?
Yeah, great. And can they be built on flat land? Do they have to be built on flat land, or can they have stepped facilities?
There's multiple campuses, so if you have multiple site campuses, they can be at different levels. However, the risk of flooding is just something that we would be looking at pretty closely.
Yeah. Okay. And is noise an issue?
Yes, although a lot of these data centers are being built next to residential, so whilst it's an issue, there are ways to baffle some of that noise.
And presumably they'd have to meet local regulations around noise.
Yep.
As well. Belinda, can you give me a thumbs up or down if we can go another minute? Or yep, okay. Let me just sort of see if there's a few themed questions here. Probably back to power generation, and if you've seen any examples of green power generation, or have you seen any looking at battery storage systems, those sorts of things.
You want me to answer that one too?
Yeah.
Thanks,
we have,
Richard.
yeah, we have done a feasibility study some time ago around a multi-green power supply project, and that was a combination of solar, wind, and hydrogen. However, what we're finding is the cost and real estate you need for all of those things, and even batteries. I mean, we're talking significant infrastructure. So it's not talking about a house battery where it's relatively compact size. It just wasn't feasible in the end. So I think that's the challenge that we've got for the next step around how do we actually make it fully green.
Yeah, and like with water, are there any innovations around recycling water, or does it need to go into a sewage system? Or
I can answer that one.
Yep.
So well, there is a bit of innovation that we're looking at the moment. So one particular site, we're actually looking to harvest treated water from a SPS or a sewer pumping station. So generally it's treated to a level that's sitting water discharged into waterways. So we're looking to reroute that water back into data centers, but that also costs, depending on where that treatment plant is in relation to the data center, costs a bit of money in terms of infrastructure to get it to there. So there is items like that where we're looking, you can use recycled water if there is a recycled water network in the location of the data center, but also treated water can be used.
Great. And then just quickly, we might actually send some follow-up questions if that's all right. But within your side of this equation, have you got any information on job density, or how industry is looking? So 2 questions there. Any information on job density, and have you come across an industry-led initiative around contributions to power and water production and infrastructure?
Because that's 2 prongs. The first on job density, not aware of anything to that regard, but I can take that on notice and see what we have on hand. But otherwise, in terms of the second point, then Arun or Richard might have some context there.
Are there any plans from industry to service their own sites?
Oh, sorry, I didn't get that. What was that again? Sorry.
So have you heard of any industry's plans or to make the contribution to power and water supplies and servicing of the sites, or does that still come back to government?
Yeah, it does come back to government. I have heard of certain providers potentially looking at obviously having to build these data centers in built up areas, as Jordan mentioned in his presentation, but then offsetting electrical from building like solar farms, for example, but and then offsetting that the data center usage using those solar farms potentially. But again, it just draws too much power. So in order to do that, it needs to be a pretty large solar farm as well, which depending on who the provider is, again, might not have the funds to do both the data center plus the solar farm or battery storage, as Richard mentioned before.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Well, we're six minutes over our allocated time, so if it's okay, I might leave this session here. Jordan, Aaron, Richard, thank you so much for that. Jordan, particularly for the presentation. We will, if it's okay, follow up with a couple of questions on notice, but other questions we might be able to follow up in the rest of our workshop as well. So thank you all very, very much. Now, I understand you're very busy people, so if you need/want to drop off the call at this point, that's fine. But thanks again. We really appreciate your expert input here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Belinda Comnenos.
Excellent. And just making sure you can see the screen, Bronwyn, which I assume means everyone else can read. Excellent. And thank you so much for inviting the team from Astrolab Group to take on this part of the session. And we will try to keep the speaking brief because, as Bronwyn said at the start, this is as much about a bit of sharing your experience and your knowledge where things are at the moment, so that the NGAA can work towards bringing that all together and working with you as member council. So for our session or next little 45 minutes, what we're doing is just to give a bit of a context for, you know, what that market perspective might mean for local government, and really looking at 4 areas around land use and infrastructure, jobs, and regional development versus that local impact. You know, absolutely, it's great that every member council is here. And so what we decided to do, rather than try to do a little bit about everything, we've got a bit of a case study around Blacktown City Council, who we've been working with, so we can give a bit of colour to some of those tensions and talk about. Then it's the breakout session, and we'll come back for some report back and next steps. So before we get into thinking about what it means for local government and context, the case study, this is a bit of a grouping of the questions that you raised during the registration for this event, and I definitely saw these coming out in the questions to Colliers, and I also invite you to keep adding those questions as we go along, or comments. So really there was 5 main areas that people across the board were most interested in. So that council role around policy settings and strategic planning, but also how to advocate if you do want to have data centres coming in that you've identified land. How do you position yourself for that? Energy and water, which we saw that conversation that we've just had on, particularly interest around renewable energy, sustainability, you know, whether things like water cooling technology, you know, what is the implications of those, were some of the specific questions that come out. And also just understanding data centre requirements, how and where they can be built, the impact on local infrastructure challenges, both pre, during and post development. So, you know, really those actual, you know, tactile questions around what you can expect when a data centre is being built and running. Understanding the economic value and local benefit was a big one, and also just understanding some of those long-term trends and future needs, including how you might plan for contingencies. So one question was raised around, you know, what do you do when a data centre shuts down, which has happened internationally. So you can see there's different perspectives there of what people are wanting to cover. won't get to them all, I'm sure, but that's why if you keep putting them in the chat, we can follow that up after. So that is it from me for the moment. I'm going to hand over to Amanda to just give a bit of an overview of the local government context and that case study. So over to you, Amanda.
Thanks, Belinda. So yeah, and as Bronwyn shared up front, you know, around these NGAA members and the role that you are playing in terms of housing supply, and so these tensions that we're seeing, as Jordan really explained quite well, in the patterns of development and the scale of the development that's coming through in the market. And so what we've observed, these key tensions, and it's coming up through the questions so far around, you know, land use and the take up of these large employment and industrial lands is something that we really need to understand a bit better. Infrastructure, that's clearly come through as these questions around our capacity of our networks and the service requirements for these developments. Particularly from a local government perspective and your local labour force, and how do we retain and support the jobs that we want in our local areas when some of these developments, and that question around job density, definitely things that we want to look into in how do you kind of balance those trade-offs of one type of development over another. And one thing that's really coming through for us is thinking about data center development having regional benefits, but perhaps what we're seeing on the ground is those local impacts that is occurring for local communities. So is there a better framework of how we might be able to manage that moving forward as the scale of this development increases? Thanks, Belinda. So just a bit of a snapshot. As Belinda said, we'll do a case study into Blacktown City Council. And here in New South Wales, there are a few things that are happening, which is really pushing us to have a focus around data centres. There's been a Legislative Council inquiry, which NGAA wrote a submission to last week, looking into the scale and trajectory of data centres. And just on the same day that submissions closed, Infrastructure New South Wales released a discussion paper around data centres and looking into what kind of frameworks are needed to guide investment and development in New South Wales. And so just in Sydney, in Sydney's growth areas alone, which a lot of these your members are in, 18 state significant data centres are proposed. Data centres in Sydney as of 2025 already consuming the electricity equivalent to powering 338,000 homes. And so this speaks to some of these, you know, concerns and these questions that are being raised across the group. 3.5 billion litres of drinking water. So that's the equivalent of 1,400 Olympic swimming pools to fill up each year. And as Jordan mentioned as well, in what we're seeing in the development pipeline is that the number of these data centres and the scale of these centres are also growing. So this is a bit of that context here that we are observing in Greater Sydney, and I'm sure, as Jordan mentioned, also we might be observing in the Victorian markets as well. I'll go to the next slide, Linda. Thank you. And so this is some mapping that we wanted to show for Greater Sydney and looking at where the approved development and pipeline is. And you can really see that clustering, particularly for the larger scale data centres in Western Sydney. We've also mapped here where your high voltage transmission lines are, and we're seeing this pattern where the high voltage transmission lines are is also where we're seeing that clustering of data centres. And so, you know, speaking to that point, which was raised a bit early on, where are we seeing the pipeline and where future development might be going? So just bringing this information together, giving us a little bit more of a clearer picture around this. So next slide, please, Belinda. Apologies if you feel like I'm racing through. I just want to make sure we've got enough time as well to go into our group discussions. And so, yeah, this is a bit more of a focus on Blacktown City Council in Sydney. And so the purple areas are where our industrial zone land are. And once again, the locations of those high voltage transmission lines, and we really see this little clustering around that Eastern Creek precinct and around Huntingwood as well. And so Blacktown local government area hosts 5 operational data centres with 1 under construction, and in the pipeline there are 2 centres proposed for expansion and a further 3 new centres proposed to be built. And so in terms of the total capital investment for New South Wales, Blacktown has 51% of that share in capital investment. So a lot happening in this area. And just as Bronwyn mentioned up front, you know, where Blacktown is hosting a large proportion of this residential growth in Sydney and needing to service this demand, this is where we're really trying to understand better the patterns of this development and seeing where, you know, bringing to fore some of the trade-off discussions that we need to think about, or what type of perhaps policy interventions or better guidance so that we make the most of what's happening on the ground. So another thing to notice here, once again, around that trade-off and land use, Eastern Creek, you know, a very well located industrial land with great connections to the motorway, connecting to the rest of Sydney and through Western regional New South Wales. So once again, those trade-offs that need to be considered and that competition for land that we have in these industrial precincts. Thanks, Belinda. It's a bit of question earlier on, you know, what kind of land, what sites do data centre needs? This is a very high level, but in understanding what are some of the site requirements that data centre developers are looking for. And as I mentioned before, from the mapping, what we're seeing is that somewhat coincides with sites that also work very well for freight and logistics and warehousing land as well. So, you know, just understanding this and the land use and infrastructure requirements, you know, wanting to inform how, you know, this can create quite different outcomes for a local area in terms of employment opportunities. We spoke to, you know, job numbers, what type of jobs and what's available locally, and in terms of the skills of the working population, electricity and water consumption. Another thing that we thought about as well is in traffic generation. Perhaps if you have less people on a site, maybe you have less traffic coming through a precinct. Is that good or bad? Is that something you want? So all these things, you know, to really just, we're trying to bring a bit more better information there so we can kind of weigh up these discussions. And so something that's, you know, we've been thinking about, how does this align to council's economic development objectives? You know, it's just about being better informed. And perhaps do we need to consider what land needs are needed for this particular type of development, how much land and where, in the same ways that we look at industrial and economic development as well. Another point we've been thinking a little bit about is framing data centres as an infrastructure asset, and the approach, that coordinated approach to servicing and looking at it from a network perspective is something that we want to kind of explore a little bit more on, and therefore the need to coordinate across government and stakeholders, understanding what land needs are, what sites are best used for operations, and as we keep coming back to what are the trade-offs and how do we look at what the cumulative impacts of this type of development are. And so for us, this really shines a light on, you know, what are our approaches to strategic planning in this area, as well as what are some of our practices and policies and how councils might input into assessment of this type of development. Here in New South Wales, we have a state significant assessment pathway for data centres, and that's where we're seeing the state government leading on a lot of the assessments for the majority of this development, at least recent ones. And so bringing all this to light. The next slide, please. And so, yeah, the one thing that really is drawing our thinking towards is around this concept of regional benefits but local impacts. So councils that are hosting data centre developments are really enabling regional benefits but feeling the local impacts. You know, we've talked a bit about the jobs and the trade-offs in hosting this type of development. And we've reflected that this could be similar to what we've observed in the renewable energy project space, where we're seeing in New South Wales, for example, the rollout of the renewable energy zones and hosting of these projects are creating a bit of attention. Let's be honest, with local communities that are hosting these projects, that where we do all recognise there are regional and state benefits to them, but there are localised impacts that are being felt. And so I think like we're playing a little bit of catch up in that space on how we best manage these tensions, but I believe there's an opportunity here where we could have a, you know, take on some of those lessons learned and have a think about how we consider this in this area around data centres. Is there an approach that we could design where councils and local communities are compensated for the contributions that they make or the trade-offs that they are making in hosting these developments? And I'll just leave that there. So what I think what the things that we've shared so far is really just a bit of framing and where we'd like to you know, spend the rest of our time this afternoon is breaking into some breakout sessions where as a group and from our shared experiences and your unique perspectives, are there some questions and issues that we could explore together? There are three main themes that we would like to explore: current state and positioning. And so what's your experience in your local government area? Have you developed a position around the role of data centres in your local government area? What kind of advocacy have you done with state and federal government? We can explore some of these tensions that we've talked through so far this afternoon around planning and land use, infrastructure and servicing, jobs, economic development, and those regional benefits versus local impacts. And around advocacy, I think as the NGAA would really like to hear, you know, what do councils need from the state and federal government in relation to this? And perhaps what do you need from each other? What lessons can we learn and experiences can we share together? So in a moment, we'll break out into some small groups and then we can come back together to share some of the things that we discussed. Is there anything else to add there, Michelle?
No, other than enjoy your rooms. Lots of chatting, everybody, and we'll see you back shortly.
Thank you.
Well, countdown is on.
Countdown is on. Okay, so people are moving to rooms. There we go. People are accepting. Amazing. Bron and Anne, I'm not sure why you're not automatically moving, because you were supposed to be going to Anne, can you go to room 1? How do I get you to go to room 1? Assign participants. How do I get you to go to room 1? Why can't you go into a room?
I'll leave the meeting. I don't know. How do I do that?
Okay, so go to...
Hang on. I found rooms. Okay, I'm joining room 1.
Okay. Oh, Bron, you're managing rooms. Okay, you're going into room 2. She's gone. And Robert... Robert. You're going to be in room 6, Robert, if you can hear me.
So how do I do that?
That's a good question. Let's see, take over. I'm going to find you and there we go. Room 6. Okay, that hasn't worked. What if I go unassigned and then I'll reassign you? Oh, he's gone. Assign participants. Room 6. Save. Okay. I close the room.
Doesn't want to be prescriptive. Oh,
We got everyone back.
We're getting people back. This is when people are still talking and they don't press the button, and it's awful to break up the conversations that we're having, because I don't know about you, but room 3 was popping off with the chats. So apologies for having to rip everyone back in the room, but also conscious of time. So yeah, I'll hand back over to you, Belinda.
I'll hand straight over to Michael from the
Thanks,
team.
Belinda. So what I was hoping to do was go around the grounds and just get some feedback. I don't imagine we can get everyone's feedback or commentary. If you do have thoughts that you weren't able to share, please put them in the chat so that we can go through the chat and collate them. I might kick us off just having regard to group 4 and to stimulate the conversation. So we talked about socioeconomic frameworks, not just financial frameworks, and the ability to do adequate strategic planning, having regard to other land uses, interface risks. And that led to a question about what's the role of local government when these things have some form of state designation, state assessment. And Whittlesey shared that they are developing a paper, as yet unclear whether that will move to policy or, planning scheme review, but in the first instance, it's to get a position from the council. If anyone from Group 4 wanted to add anything, please do. Otherwise, I might invite someone from Group 1.
I think that was ours. I think I was in Group 1. I just had a few quick fire questions at the end. The overall message was we need more education for the public, but also for councils on all of these issues that we're talking about. There's infrastructure coordination that needs to happen. The security of the energy and the water needs to be there. And South Australia, where there's a little bit of a lag before data centres arrive, is connected in Playford. They have 95% of the potential employment land for Adelaide, so it is likely to be there, but it needs to be serviced, and so it will depend on if there's benefits to be had from developing data centres. Those need to be realised by unlocking that employment land. I think there's pressure on the concentration of the pressure is in the city of Swan, where there's 4 data centres, and there is quite a lot of public concern. So I think, the education infrastructure coordination and just allaying some of the fears about energy and water, but actually dealing with them and servicing the employment land would be the key ones from our group. And unless anybody else, have I misrepresented or spoke or something? Like to say anything else? Curious to have the balance between the concerns and the benefits as well.
Yeah.
And I think.
Yep. I don't know that we're going to have time to go through every table, just being pragmatic. But why don't we go for a representation of the different states? So I had a group of Victorians. I'll invite. Let's invite table 7 from New South Wales. Do you need a reminder?
Table 7, was it, Michael?
Yep, that's
us.
Yep.
Maybe I'll just call out something useful that came through our discussion. Megan from Penrith Council said she attended a Committee for Sydney workshop where they were compiling some information for their submission to the inquiry, and just maybe a call out to look out for that, because it looks like that brings together a lot of the thinking around data centre site requirements, what councils are thinking, what developers are thinking, and things like that. So that might be quite a nice little resource for people to go to.
Great. I'll jump to table 3. So that's
Okay, I will go through because we don't have much time. I think we are the table 3. We are KC Council and Cardinia Council. We are just outside the main municipality area, and we'll be getting one data center. It comes as a huge one in our council, so we don't have much guidance on how to assess it. So we are requesting state government to provide some guidance. And another thing is the loss of jobs for the long term. In the short term, we might get jobs for construction, but later on, it's insignificant. In the presentation, it was presented like that, so I'm a little bit worried about that. But regionally, it will benefit that data center. And the other thing we talked about is why not to use some recycled water, since we have some recycled water tap connections for the residential, but I don't know for this scale whether it is enough or not. And we also discussed about the use of rain harvesting and to minimize the heat generated on that huge surface of cladding as well. They are doing metal cladding for the buildings. Those ones, but still we need some guidance from state government who have already assessed applications. This is first time for us.
Thank you for that.
Anyone else? Yeah, Michelle, you want to add something?
No, I think you've covered it all. Yeah, because it's one of our first. I think the state government has been deciding on most of the data center. So, it'll be great if we can get some guidance on how we should assess what are some of the requirements that we must be looking at and require from the applicants. And yeah.
Belinda, can I throw to you and then to Bronwyn to close?
Yeah, I will throw, if I could, Tess in the group. Just we've been speaking about some very big issues, but she just ended with a great anecdote of what some very much on the ground impacts around poles and wires are having on roads and street greening. Tessie there.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. And look, if anyone wants to reach out, feel free to. So I'm from Wyndham City Council. We've processed, so we've had 9 data centre applications come through us, 8 of them coming directly to council, 1 through the DFP process. I've personally found it much easier to process, or there's been much more kind of direction given by council than going through the DFP process. So yeah, if anyone wants any background, let me know. But yeah, in terms of data centers as a whole, obviously, they're very, very resource intensive. One of the other sides of things that we're seeing come through is the respective infrastructure that they need. So they need a lot of servicing, they need a lot of poles and wires. So especially within the growth area context and your PSPs, we can't fit them within the typical kind of road reserve. So we're losing a lot of street trees. We're losing, there's visual impacts. There's a lot of impacts to the community more broadly, and just how to fit that infrastructure, those easements and stuff like that to actually power or connect up to these sites. So that's another impact beyond all of the sustainability issues and the relatively low employment creation directly and stuff like that. So we're also trying to explore some opportunities as our EcoDev member had stated, so in terms of procurement or employment training and things like that. But again, it seems a little bit more weighted to kind of, I guess, the disbenefits. But yeah, thank you. Oh, sorry, in advocacy, we need policy. We need state government direction. We need the direction in terms of land uses. We need it on employment. We need it on the sustainability side of things and emissions and net zero and where we are going with this. We need an ESD tool which actually measures the operations rather than just the initial build out. And yeah, also I've just been trying to work with DTP and VPA in terms of that more strategic, where is all this infrastructure going? Yeah, anyway, so we need policy. We really need policy. We need stats. We need to be able to justify this. It's getting really tricky as in my role as town planner deciding on these things to try and justify these outcomes that these developers are expecting. Anyway,
thank you.
Thanks,
Tim. I'm mindful people are jumping off. Can I throw to you, Bronwyn?
Yep, just one last minute to wrap up. Thank you all very, very much for your contributions. We've heard a lot about the need for more information, for education, some frustration around the influence and impact local government can have. We need a clearer sense of where local government can make a decision and where state government has the authority. We need to explore more around employment, sustainability, visual impact, all of those sorts of things before we can even start to say what can local government get out of this in the long term. So I think we're at this very early stage. What we will do from here is collate all of this information, come up with a bit of a plan. We'll come back to this group, to everyone who attended this, and we'll work out a bit of a next steps feature of what you need from us and what we can do to assist. So thank you all again very much, particularly thanks to the AstroLab team. You're amazing. And if any councils need some assistance in this area, definitely reach out to Belinda and Michael. They're fantastic. So thank you all very much. Look forward to speaking to you again in the next 3, 4, 5 weeks. Sort out what's next. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.